From the Oklahoman newsroom, it is time for Thunder Thursday. I'm Jenny Carlson here in studio with Thunder beat writer Eric Horn. And Eric, I think I've been saying it every week that basketball is back, but now I really, truly mean it. We had a game last night, folks. Wednesday night at the Peak, an exhibition game, a preseason game. It doesn't count. I mean, I know
it's kind of back. Basketball is kind of back.
Kind of back. We're going to have it for real here in a couple weeks, but we actually had, men in short shorts and, referees with actual whistles and everything like that. So that was kind of a move in the right direction.
We had men in short shorts. We had referees blowing the whistle a lot because the rules have changed in terms of grabbing. They're being a lot more cognizant, or not cognizant. They're being a lot more ticky-tacky about the fouling. Game took longer than it probably should have, but it's back.
Yeah.
Back. Basketball is back.
Yeah.
Not a lot of people played last night.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about, maybe we should say the men in short pants, because the shorts really aren't that short. But the guys in short pants, we got to see some of these guys that are going to play big roles. Obviously, you've still got Russell Westbrook rehabbing, Andre Robertson rehabbing, and then sort of a last-minute scratch was Paul George. Do we know any more about his situation, why he wasn't available to the Thunder?
We don't. Basically, I'm literally walking in the building and I get a text about Paul George not being there that night. He wasn't in the building. Russell Westbrook wasn't there either. Russell Westbrook was probably just excused because it's preseason and he doesn't necessarily need to be there if he wasn't going to play, even though Andre Robertson was there, so you can have your moral debates as to whether or not a teammate should be on the bench when he's injured or not, whatever. But Paul George was definitely a surprise. He was a guy who you expected to play, we were excited to see play, and it is preseason. We'll probably get more information on that Thursday, and he'll probably be a guy who you'd expect to be available for Minnesota if he's healthy. We'll just see how long these personal reasons that the Thunder cites stretch into the preseason. But, another guy, Abdel Nader, doesn't play. He was dealing with some left knee soreness. But good news for the Thunder is they got Alex Abrines back, and he didn't look half bad, looked a little bit winded, but gave good effort, and he put in some pretty good minutes for him.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about Abrines. We'll get to some of these other guys that maybe played more and better than Abrines, but, obviously the debate is out there. Who starts at that shooting guard spot until Andre Robertson returns? Obviously Abrines has had his injury issues, but did you feel like he made some good strides and maybe made that opening statement that he deserves that spot for a while?
Yeah, he looked good shooting the ball. I think he was 2 of 3 from three-point range. He looked fluid there. Hustled well on defense. Even though, he couldn't get to a 50-50 ball in one instance, he got back on defense in transition, forced a bad jump shot from the Pistons. So I thought he looked good. I still, at this point, I think I've changed my mind and think that, Billy Donovan's going to roll with Terrence Ferguson until otherwise noted. He still wants Alex Abrines coming off of that bench roll, and then they're not going to push him too much as he comes back from those back spasms. Alex Abrines, I don't know if he's a guy who's necessarily going to be able to play a ton of minutes over the course of his career just because his body's just failed him so much as a professional. So I think Billy Donovan, just for the athleticism purposes and being able to preserve Abrines more, is going to play Terrence Ferguson in the starting lineup, or some rotation of guys in the starting lineup until Andre Robertson gets back. It's disappointing because you'd want Alex Abrines to play more with those starters to where he can get some more quality shot looks. But it seems like Billy Donovan is going to roll with this for now. All
right. Well, what about some other guys that started and were pretty impressive? Dennis Schroder and Steven Adams spring to mind for me. Eric, when you look at two guys that have been starters in the league for a while, not obviously together, but looking like they've played together for quite a while on Wednesday night. Yeah,
they look comfortable. Look, I wrote about it on Sunday. These guys have talked to each other about that pick and roll combination, what each other likes. This goes all the way back to the end of July when they first got together in Los Angeles. I mean, that was some of the first conversations they had. What do you like in pick and roll? How do you like screens? And they both appreciate each other's games. Dennis Schroder appreciates that Adams is a guy who's unselfish. He always says that about Adams when he talks about him, and that he holds his screens and he's not slipping the screens early to try and get the ball or try and pop out for a shot. He's taking care of priority number one, and that's the point guard. And Adams is a guy who likes Dennis Schroder because he sets his man up well in the screen and roll game. He's staying low. He's not getting lazy and veering out farther from the screen than he should. He's getting that guy into Adams' body so Adams can get a clean hit on him. And we all know Steven Adams loves contact. So these guys are almost like a match made in heaven, basically. And you saw it last night. Just the different passes that Dennis Schroder was able to throw to him. Adams' hands have improved every year he's been in the league. And you saw it on full display last night. Limited minutes for those guys. They didn't play the fourth quarter, but they were highly effective when they were in there. And if they do play into the fourth, as the Pistons did with some of their starters, they probably win the game.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit more about Schroder and Adams on the court. I want to talk more about that in a second. But you mentioned Adams and his toughness. We've got to talk about this GM survey that came out. You had a chance to ask him about it. And Steven Adams, as Steven Adams does, had a hilarious answer to being voted the toughest guy in the NBA.
Do I get a prize? What'd I win? No. Steven Adams wants to be compensated, which is perfectly understandable. The guy wants to be compensated for getting such awards. The GM survey, the NBA.com does it every year, where they basically poll GMs inside baseball, the GMs sometimes don't actually fill these things out. They actually pass it off to their communication staffs or people in the building. Might be an intern filling this stuff out for all we know. But this conglomerate of people thought that Steven Adams was the toughest guy in the NBA. Last year, he tied with, I think, Draymond Green and Kawhi Leonard as the toughest guy in the NBA, receiving 14% of that GM survey. This year was overwhelming. He received 33% of the vote. LeBron James was second, around 13%. Adams doesn't care. Adams got the news yesterday. I told him, and he's just like, okay, do I get something? And he also called the entire thing weird and said that we're getting bored. And he's absolutely right. We get bored. We need things to talk about in preseason, and we put out the poll. While it's much appreciated, I appreciate the work that NBA.com's John Schumann does in gathering all of this opinion, because it's interesting to kind of gauge the pulse of the league and what these teams, whether it's the GMs or the people working there, what they're thinking about going into the season. And it's clear that Adams is well respected around the league. People see him as an intimidating presence. And I think that Steven Adams low-key kind of likes the fact that he's thought of as an intimidating presence. I mean, I've talked to some people in his inner circle that work out with him in the offseason. He had a directive a couple years ago to go in and work out, and he went to the guys he worked out with and said, look, I want to be a guy who's looked at as a guy who's not necessarily feared, but people have a respect for in that regard in terms of his physicality. Yeah. So while Steven Adams says he doesn't care about this stuff, he's made it a mission of his to be one of the strongest, toughest guys in the NBA, and it's clearly showed in his game.
But I think some people might look at it as that's all he is. And this segues back into what I wanted to talk about on the court with Steven Adams. Wednesday night, that exhibition game showed a lot of people, and maybe it reminded us more than anything, that this guy is becoming a really refined talent as well. And, you mentioned his ability in the pick and roll and the screen game and those sorts of things. But he moved the ball well. He passes it well. He thinks the game well. I mean, we know defensively just how good he is. We know that toughness factor. But some of that might cover up just how refined and skilled this guy's become. I mean, he's still young, but he's really evolving, Eric, and we really saw some results of that on Wednesday night.
Yeah, it's Steven Adams is a guy who's capable of more than he does on a standard night, and most nights the Thunder doesn't necessarily need him to do those things. Maybe they should use him more in that capacity, and I think that that's more up to Paul George and Russell Westbrook letting go of the reins a little bit, particularly Russell Westbrook, because he has the ball in his hands all the time. Now, look, you can't knock the success of that because Russell Westbrook has gotten the Thunder to the playoffs the past 2 seasons, and he's been one of the best players in the league since he entered the league. But Steven Adams is clearly a guy who's capable of more responsibility on offense, and he might deserve it in some regard. This is a guy who pulled down 9 offensive rebounds last night. For a team that doesn't shoot very well, that buys you extra possessions. Mm-hmm. And Steven Adams is getting to the point to where he's not only buying those extra possessions, but he's becoming the primary, or not primary, but last night he showed he can be the primary creator or the guy who delivers that final pass when he does get the offensive rebound. It's not so much about him getting the ball and scanning around and looking for somebody else to get the ball to, like a Russell Westbrook, to finish the playoff. Steven Adams can hold it for a minute. He can survey the floor. He had a nice give and go with Timothy Luwawu-Cabarrot last night when TLC was actually really struggling at that point in the game. Steven Adams was the one who got him going. He got Dennis Schroder a spot-up three-pointer actually not a spot up, a catch and shoot three-pointer off of an offensive rebound. So Steven Adams can act as the focal point for the Thunder's offense, and I think that it would probably benefit them at times for that to be an avenue, because as we saw last year in the playoffs, the Thunder got kind of bogged down doing the same thing over and over again. If you're using different points of attack and different points of creation, I think that they can give defenses a little bit more thought as to, okay, we're not just going to zero in on Russell Westbrook, or we can't just sit in the paint. Maybe you pull Steven Adams up, have him operating from the high post and surveying the floor and being a passer, and then that changes the way that teams have to defend you.
What do you think about Dennis Schroder as it relates more long term from what you saw in this preseason opener? I mean, I know it's the preseason. I know it's the first game. I know players were missing, but Dennis Schroder likely going to have to play that point for at least a minute as the season gets going, and then he's a guy that you have on your roster. You're going to integrate him in. What did you sort of feel in terms of, the short term being the guy, being the starter at that point guard, but then more long term, sort of how is he going to meld into what the Thunder really wants to do long term?
I feel like he had a pretty good shot discretion last night, and I thought that was interesting considering he could have taken a lot of different shots. He's surprised me in terms of his patience. And we'll see how that turns out when Russell Westbrook gets back, when Paul George is in the lineup. And Schroder is going to have to play minutes with Russell Westbrook because he's one of their four best players, and they need to maximize, the best lineups they can get out there offensively. So to me, it was a great start for Dennis Schroder. I don't know if it's necessarily sustainable because teams are going to be ratcheting up their defenses once the regular season starts. But he's absolutely going to shred second units once Russell Westbrook gets back. He's too good for second unit point guards. He's too good for a lot of first unit point guards. And he's a guy who already you see the chemistry he has with Steven Adams. We saw some of the chemistry he had with Paul George in the blue and white scrimmage. So I think it's going to be a really good year for Dennis Schroder. I think the biggest question still remains how he blends with Russell Westbrook and how they play off of each other.
And that's going to be really interesting because they really won't have worked together much.
They have to.
Yeah.
They have to. The Thunder has to play those guys together in order to maximize these lineups. It was good to see Dennis Schroder put in the defensive effort he did at times last night, running guys off the three-point line and hustling. That's going to be necessary for the Thunder because, look, frankly, Dennis Schroder hasn't been a good defender in the past year with Atlanta. He was one of the worst players in terms of defensive rating for the Hawks last year. He said it was because he had a lot of responsibility on his shoulders. It was probably a combination of the responsibility and the fact that the Hawks weren't playing for anything. The same can be said for Russell Westbrook, not because the Thunder wasn't playing for anything, but Russell Westbrook has a lot of responsibility on his shoulders. Maybe if he plays with Dennis Schroder and he has another guy to handle the ball, maybe if he plays with a Paul George, Russell Westbrook can focus more on the defensive end where he has been a liability at times and he hasn't put in the requisite effort needed for a championship team. And the shocking thing is the Thunder was one of the best teams in the league defensively with Russell Westbrook kind of playing that lackadaisical style at times and not being totally focused on his task. So if they get a fully focused Russell Westbrook, a fully focused Dennis Schroder, and throw Andre Robertson into that mix, that's a team that's a top 5 defensive team, and it should be without any excuses because they just have so much ability, and Steven Adams is one of the top defenders at his position as well. Yeah. So those guys have to play together. They're going to have to be really good together, and I think it can work. It's just a matter of who's going to be able to give some of that ball handling duty when they're together, who's going to take some shots that they're not used to taking, whether it's catch and shoot shots or fewer shots in the offense. And but it can be a good partnership because they're just too talented for it not to work.
Yeah, definitely going to be interesting to see how that evolves as Westbrook gets healthy, Robertson gets healthy, those guys start playing together. Last night with the exhibition opener, we got a chance to see some faces that we had never seen in Thunder jerseys before. I'm, again, fully recognizing that this is exhibition, this is not the full roster. What was your sense of those new faces and how they might, once the season actually gets going, how they might play into rotations, what Billy Donovan wants to do, different things like that?
Nerlens Noel was good. He was good in parts. I think the finishing is going to come for him. He had an odd night where he might have missed at the least 3 dunks that were, he clearly had a dunk and it would just go off the rim and just bounce off the rim 6 or 7 times or whatever. That was strange. He'll clean that up. I think his energy is good in the second unit. He had a period in the beginning of the fourth quarter where he and Raymond Felton were really imposing themselves on the game. Raymond Felton's going to be Raymond Felton, whether it's as the second point guard behind Dennis Schroder or whether it's as the third guy. I think he's just going to be a steady presence as he was last year, and you really can't ask much more from the third point guard on your team. Jeremy Grant, weird start for him, but the most encouraging part from Jeremy Grant is despite the fact that he didn't shoot very well, he got to the line as he did last year, and he looked equally as comfortable, getting to the spots he wanted to get to on the floor, particularly in going to the rim. It's just, again, it just is so impressive that Jeremy Grant has gone from a player who, when he got here 2 seasons ago, that you didn't want him taking dribbles, you didn't want him going to the rack, to where you trust Jeremy Grant in those situations and you trust him getting to the rack. He just didn't finish last night, and he said it to me to the side after the game. It was just like he just missed 5 layups, but the moves and the execution of the moves was solid, and that'll turn around for Jeremy Grant. TLC started off slow. As I said, Adams was a guy who got him more involved as the game went on, and TLC's offense started to come the more he was on the floor. So he looked better as the game went on. I think he's going to have to develop a little bit more of a rhythm. But, the Thunder's reserve looked pretty solid. I think they did a good job. They just got to finish better. That's what killed them in the fourth quarter. Nerlens Noel misses a dunk with about 36 seconds to go in a one-possession game. Can't have that. No. Got to finish those. But in those situations in the regular season, Steven Adams is going to be in there flushing the ball. So,
sure.
But Nerlens might be in there too because Billy Donovan wants to play those two together. So, just better finishing. It's first preseason game. Some of that stuff is just kind of like whatever. But you saw the ball moving more for the Thunder. You saw those second unit guys engaged. And it seemed like a promising start from that regard.
What other takeaways, Eric? Anything else left over just from your thoughts as you watch these guys for the first time on the court Wednesday night?
I mentioned it briefly at the beginning of Thunder Thursday. It's going to take some time for these players to get used to this, the way they're calling the game. The fouling, they were calling a lot of ticky-tack stuff, a lot of the holding fouls. You saw this motion for referees a lot. They're not letting these guys hold on defense anymore, and they're going to call it really quickly. So it's going to take some adjustment for the players. I asked Alex Abridas about it. He's like, there's not much I can do. You just got to adjust. And he's a guy who struggled defensively throughout his career. So you're going to have to be anticipatory. The league is definitely catering the game, as are all sports, whether it's football, baseball, or basketball. Everybody's catering towards offense because it's harder to get eyes on the game than it ever has been before with social media and all the different things we have going on in the world.
Yeah.
So it's a disadvantage to good defensive teams. But the Thunder's advantage is they've got great athletes, and those athletes can put themselves in a position to be successful without having to hold. The teams that are holding people all the time are the teams that aren't good athletically.
Yeah.
The Thunder really doesn't have any excuses. They got length and athleticism all over the floor, so they should be able to compensate for that and the rule changes more than any other team in the league.
Before we get out of here on Thunder Thursday, let's talk about the next exhibition game, which that's Friday. It's an every other day exhibition schedule for the Thunder through next Tuesday before their exhibition preseason schedule is done. But they're getting ready to head to Minnesota, Eric, as are you, for the game on Friday night. Minnesota, the epicenter of drama right now in the NBA with Jimmy Butler and the situation there. What we say here on Thunder Thursday may be vastly different by the time this video hits the web, but things are seemingly, in flux right now. But Jimmy Butler essentially is saying, I'm not playing for you guys. He's just sitting right now, and really strange situation going on up in Minnesota.
It's an odd one. The reports have that Tom Thibodeau wants Jimmy Butler to stay. Jimmy Butler reportedly is just refusing to go back. That locker room is a mess in terms of Jimmy Butler clashing with the younger guys, Karl Anthony Towns and Andrew Wiggins. Miami seems to be the team that's getting the most talk right now in terms of getting a deal done. One of the primary pieces in that deal is Edmonds' own Josh Richardson, the potential deal that's on the table, or Minnesota is continually interested in Josh Richardson, and it makes perfect sense. He's one of the up-and-coming two-way guys in this league, a really solid defender and getting better on offense every year. And, Josh Richardson is a guy who Tom Thibodeau would really desire because he plays that defense first. Mm-hmm. So whether or not they can get a deal done, before the regular season remains to be seen. But yeah, Minnesota's in a completely different place than the Thunder is right now. And that this was a team in Minnesota that went to the playoffs for the first time in quite some time last year. And they were a thorn in the Thunder's side. And all of a sudden, they're looking like a team that's not even going to be close to the playoffs if Jimmy Butler's not there.
Well, and think about this too, Eric. A year ago, when Minnesota acquires Butler, in sort of the same way when the Thunder acquires Paul George, you know, it looked like a transformative move. But I think a lot of people expected it to be a lot more likely that Jimmy Butler was in Minnesota long term than Paul George was in Oklahoma City long term. The opposite has happened, or it appears to have happened. It's just crazy how those scenarios have played out, because I think people really felt like, wow, Minnesota got Jimmy Butler. They are set. They're ready to go with that young core. Things have really changed as it relates to that.
Yeah, how little we know these guys and how quickly things can change. The same thing goes for Kawhi Leonard. We think that Kawhi Leonard is the perfect match for Spurs culture. Quiet guy, goes about his business, champion, and it only takes one season and a little bit of miscommunication for the whole thing to go upside down, and Kawhi Leonard's in Toronto now.
Yeah. Well, who knows what will happen before the game on Friday night in Minnesota. Jimmy Butler may still be a part of the team, not playing, not a part of the team. Who knows? But Eric's headed up there.
He ain't playing. Jimmy ain't playing, okay? We know that. Jimmy's not playing. Whether he's going to be – he's not going to be there either. He might be at some bar down the street, or he might be at the Mayo Clinic, but Jimmy's not going to be at the game on Friday, I assure you.
Fair enough. But Eric Horn will be at the game.
I'll be there.
Yeah.
I'll suit up. I'll play.
You'd play some defense for Tom Thibodeau, wouldn't you?
Yeah,
Or try.
No, he'd run me into the ground. I don't want those problems.
All right, 7 o'clock start on Friday night up in Minneapolis. Eric will be there. So for all the Thunder coverage, be sure to stay with the best coverage team anywhere at newsok.com and every day in the Oklahoman.